The letter from the bank hit me harder than a winter gust through a broken window, pending property sale stamped across the top in red. Marshall here, 58, retired engineer. The smell of cold coffee filled my kitchen as I gripped the brass key I'd carried since Dory gave it to me on our wedding day. Ever had someone you love push you to a choice you never thought you'd face? Tell me, how did you handle it? The HR manager slid the termination letter across the desk, right as I set down the coffee I'd bought to celebrate my son's promotion. Name's Walter Keene, 58, owner of calloused hands, and until this morning, a quiet accounting career. The gold pen from my first job offer lay between us untouched. Ever had life flip the script on you in a single breath? Tell me about it. The letter sat on my desk like it had a weight far heavier than its single sheet of paper could account for. Pending property sale, those words glared at me from the page, as if they knew they'd gut me before I even finished reading the rest. My hand hovered above the paper for a moment, then I picked it up, feeling the slight crinkle at the edges where my thumb pressed too hard. The ink blurred where I smudged it without realizing my palm damp with sweat. I read it once, then twice, then a third time, hoping I'd find some line, some clause that would turn this into a simple clerical error. But no, the details were clear: my address, my name, well, what was supposed to be my name on authorization forms, and a transaction already in motion. The bank was pleased to confirm the forthcoming sale of my home. Pleased. I almost laughed at the choice of words. I leaned back in my chair, the worn leather sighing beneath me, the smell of it mingling with the faint trace of old paper that always seemed to hang in this room. Through the blinds, afternoon sun painted stripes on the floor, catching motes of dust that danced in the quiet. But inside me there was no quiet. My heart thudded hard each beat, asking the same question. How could this be happening? A flash of memory last night. Ewan's name glowing on my phone screen. A missed call. No message. I'd thought it odd at the time, but not enough to return the call, in the rush of finishing up those spreadsheets I'd promised to help a neighbor with. Now the unease gnawed at me. I picked up my phone, stared at his name in my recent calls list, thumb hovering over the callback button. Instead, I set it down and stood up. The safe. I crossed the room, the floor creaking softly beneath my steps. The safe was tucked behind a row of books I hadn't touched in years. Financial law tax codes manuals I once lived by, but had no use for since retirement. My fingers traced the familiar combination on the dial. The door swung open with a small cloud of dust swirling lazily in the shaft of sunlight. Inside, my property deed was there exactly where it should be, and no sign of disturbance, no missing papers. I thumbed through other documents, tax returns, old appraisals. Even that faded photo of Dory and me the day we first stepped onto this porch, keys in hand and stars in our eyes. Everything was in place, except nothing was not really. I closed the safe, gently letting the metal door click shut, the sound somehow final. My mind raced, reaching for an explanation that didn't involve betrayal, that didn't point to the one person who shared my blood and bore my name. But logic wouldn't let me off the hook. I grabbed my phone again. This time I dialed Ewan. Each ring echoed in my ear like the ticking of a clock, counting down to something I wasn't sure I wanted to face. Voicemail. His voice, warm, familiar, a little rushed, invited me to leave a message. I didn't. I hung up and stared at the screen, fingers trembling slightly, then typed, "Call me, urgent." The room felt colder somehow. The sun outside was losing its strength, shadows creeping longer across the carpet. I rubbed my face, tried to think. That's when my gaze fell on the keybox by the door. A simple thing, oak polished smooth over years of use. I opened it out of habit, expecting to see the familiar line of keys, each one in its place like soldiers at attention. But the hook where the spare house keys had always hung was empty. My breath caught a small sound escaping me before I could stop it. I reached out, touched the bare hook, the cool metal stark against my skin. It wasn't just a letter. It wasn't just a missed call. It was this tiny damning absence that said more than any document could. Outside, the autumn breeze rustled the branches, the sound reaching my ears through the crack in the window I always left open this time of year. I stood there staring at that empty hook, the chill of the season finally seeping into my bones. And in that still moment, I knew this was no mistake. The kitchen felt colder than it should have. Maybe it was the hour, or maybe it was the weight of what I was about to see. The laptop screen glowed in the darkness, casting a pale light that barely reached the edges of the room. Outside the window, the yard lay quiet, blanketed in fallen leaves that the wind hadn't yet claimed. I drew a slow breath and clicked on the doorbell camera footage, the file from 2 nights ago, queued and waiting like a confession ready to spill. The footage started grainy, the lens smudged slightly from rain. The familiar outline of my porch. The railings I'd painted last spring came into view. For a long minute, nothing happened. I almost let myself hope that whatever I was dreading wouldn't appear. But then there it was, a figure moving cautiously at the edge of the frame. I froze the image. My heart sank before my mind even caught up. Even in the dim light, the shape was familiar, the sloped shoulders, the gait that once reminded me so much of my own when I was his age. Ewan, my son, my blood. The figure glanced toward the door, hesitated, then reached up, the glint of keys catching the porch light for a split second before they disappeared into his pocket. I ran the clip again, watching every movement, hoping to see something that would change the story forming in my head. But it played the same way each time, Ewan approaching Ewan, taking Ewan, leaving. Quiet as the autumn wind that rustled the leaves beyond the glass. I closed the video and sat in the stillness, the hum of the refrigerator, suddenly loud in the empty room. My hand drifted to the letter from the bank, now creased at the corners, the paper soft from being handled too many times. I retrieved my tax file from the kitchen drawer, the folder thicker than it needed to be. I'd always kept too much afraid of letting go of anything that might one day matter. Side by side on the screen, I placed Ewan's forged signature from the bank document next to the real one on last year's return. Even my untrained eye could see it, the hesitation in the loops, the uneven slant. But crude or not, it was dangerous. In the eyes of the law, it was enough to move a sail forward. I leaned back, the chair creaking softly beneath me. The kitchen clock ticked on, unbothered by the storm gathering in my head. My gaze shifted to the window, to the yard that had been Ewan's playground once upon a time. The garden shed sat at the back, half hidden by shadows, its roofline sagging slightly after the last winter's ice. Something nagged at me. I pushed up from the table, grabbed my coat, and stepped out into the night. The cold bit at my cheeks, the leaves crunching beneath my boots. At the shed, I ran my hand over the latch. The edge was bent, the metal scraped fresh and bright where it had given way under force. Subtle, yes, but unmistakable. I stood there for a moment, the silence pressing in. Even the wind had died down, as if the world was holding its breath. I went back inside, locking the door behind me, the key cold and heavy in my hand. At the table again, I opened the county recorder's website, fingers stiff on the keys. A search of my address pulled up the document, sale pending, final clearance in progress. My stomach clenched, the screen seeming to pulse with those words. It wasn't theoretical anymore. It was happening. My phone buzzed against the table, the sound sharp in the quiet. A message from Ewan, just 5 words, "Dad, let's talk tomorrow, please." I stared at the screen, heart pounding, mind racing. The storm had arrived. Calvin's voice had always been the kind that could settle a storm, and tonight it came through the crackling line like a lifeline. "Meet me at Bluegrass Diner. Midnight burger on me," he said, tone as steady as the man himself. I didn't bother arguing. I needed that steadiness more than I cared to admit. I grabbed my coat from the hook, the sleeves stiff from disuse, and as I did, something slipped from between the pages of Dory's old cookbook on the counter. A sticky note, yellowed at the edges, floated to the floor like a leaf in autumn. I crouched to pick it up, feeling the slight stickiness still clinging after all these years. Her handwriting, so familiar, so careful, stared back at me. "Home is where promises stay." I stood there longer than I should have, the words blurring slightly, before I tucked the note into my wallet, close to where I kept her picture. The night air was colder than it had any right to be, a sharp reminder that fall was digging in its heels. My boots crunched over the driveway gravel as I made my way to the truck, breath fogging the windshield as I started the engine. The drive to Bluegrass Diner was quiet, save for the hum of the heater, trying its best to keep the cold at bay. The diner's neon sign flickered against the darkness, casting pink and blue shadows on the wet pavement. Inside, the windows were fogged from the warmth within, the kind of warmth that came from too many pots of coffee, and the steady sizzle of a grill that hadn't been cold in decades. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside, and for a moment the weight of the world eased just a little. Calvin was already there, seated at his usual booth, near the back coat, shrugged-off sleeves, rolled fingers, twirling that old fountain pen of his. The way some men twirl worry beads. The silver band on the cap caught the light, a soft flash with each turn. He looked up as I approached, his eyes sharp behind thick glasses. "You look like you're carrying bricks in your pockets," he said, voice low. "Might be," I said, sliding into the seat opposite. The waitress, Sandy, same as always, brought coffee without asking. I wrapped my hands around the mug, grateful for the heat seeping into my chilled fingers. The smell of coffee and fried onions was thick in the air, familiar, grounding. "Start at the beginning," Calvin said, pen now poised over a napkin he'd flattened on the table. So I did. The letter, the footage, the signature. I laid it all out while he listened, silent but for the occasional nod, or jotting down a note. His face gave nothing away, but his pen moved with purpose. When I was done, he let out a slow breath. "You've got a problem, friend. But not one we can't handle." He started ticking off steps. "First, gather everything: deed, tax receipts, utility bills. Anything that ties you to that house beyond question. Next, we draft a freeze request tonight. I'll have it on the clerk's desk, first thing. Then we think about the long game, but first we stop the bleeding." His calm steadied me the way it always had. I took a sip of coffee. It was strong, bitter, exactly what I needed. "You handed him the keys, didn't you?" Calvin asked quietly. I stared down into the mug. 2017, he was fresh out of school, full of big plans. I thought I was showing trust. Calvin nodded. "We all want to believe in our kids. Sometimes that faith gets tested. Doesn't mean we stop having it. Just means we have to protect ourselves too." Outside, the wind rattled the sign, the neon flicker reflecting in the window. Inside, the world felt warmer, safer, but I knew that was just the diner talking. Calvin jotted down the plan, his script blocky but neat. He slid the napkin toward me. "Here's what we do, no mistakes. You have one shot to stop this cleanly. Be precise, Marshall." I folded the napkin, slipped it into my pocket next to Dory's note. Later, sitting in my truck, the engine idling, I pulled up the county recorder's website. The page loaded slow, the signal patchy this side of town. But when it finally appeared there, it was in black and white: transaction pending final clearance. I stared at the words until they blurred. The night felt colder. Tomorrow would bring the real fight. The key wouldn't even fit the lock anymore. I stood on my own porch, rain needling the back of my neck, where my collar had slipped, the cold seeping through my shirt. I tried again, jiggling the key, as if maybe it was just me, just the angle, just the weather. But no, it was the lock. Changed. A small glinting betrayal under the flickering porch light. I stepped back, the boards creaking under my weight, and stared at the door. The house loomed quiet behind it, dark, except for that light above me that blinked like it too was tired of trying to hold everything together. My fingers tightened around the useless key, and for a moment I thought about hurling it into the yard. But instead I slid it back into my pocket, where it clinked softly against the church newsletter I'd stuffed in there earlier. The headline peeked out, celebrating 200 years of our town's heritage. Funny, I thought, how much we talk about preserving history, as if it's as easy as lighting a candle. I pulled out my phone, thumb trembling only slightly as I scrolled to Calvin's number. The wind whipped at my coat as it rang, the storm's roar filling the gaps between each tone. He answered on the third. "Marshall?" His voice steady as ever. "The lock's changed, Cal," I said. Voice flat. "He changed the damn lock." There was a pause, just long enough for the weight of it to settle. "Okay, where are you, porch? Get off it. Get somewhere dry. I'll meet you. We'll draft the freeze tonight. First thing in the morning we file." I exhaled, tension leaking out, but leaving the anger in its place. On my way, the truck's heater groaned to life as I pulled out the wipers, smearing rain across the windshield faster than they could clear it. The storm turned the world into streaks of gray and black headlights of oncoming cars, halos in the dark. I parked beside Calvin's sedan, his outline visible behind the wheel, dashboard aglow with scattered papers. I slid into the passenger seat, rain dripping from my coat onto the rubber mat. He handed me a towel already prepared. "Got your documents?" he asked. I nodded, pulling the file folder from my bag, the paper edges already soft from handling. Together we spread them out, the interior light flickering slightly as the wind rocked the car. As we worked, Ewan's name came up on my phone screen. My finger hovered over the answer button, then I hit it, setting the phone on speaker between us. "Dad." His voice crackled thin, as if the storm carried guilt in its currents. "Ewan," my voice was steel. We should talk. I didn't want it to be like this." The sound of rain on the roof filled the pause. "Not now," I said. "Not tonight." I ended the call. Calvin didn't say anything, just pointed to one of the papers. It was a power of attorney form, or what was supposed to be. The signature was wrong. The date the notary stamp rushed uneven. My stomach twisted. "This is your nail," Marshal Calvin said quietly. "This proves intent. No more doubts." I stared at the page, the ink smudged at one corner where the copier had caught. The decision settled in me like stone. We worked in near silence, rain pounding against the windshield wipers, squealing with each pass. When we finished, I fired off the freeze request email to the county recorder. The auto reply came fast, too fast. Document clearance scheduled within 48 hours. The clock was ticking. The sound of the county clerk's stamp hitting the freeze request echoed louder than it should have in the sterile office. A sharp, wet thunk, final and absolute. For a fleeting second, I let myself feel the relief. The ink glistened under the fluorescent lights, still wet, the letters of my name and case number locked in place on the official seal. But the weight in my chest didn't lift. I knew this was just the opening move in what was shaping up to be the hardest fight of my life. Calvin stood beside me, arms crossed, watching the clerk with the same steady gaze that had guided me through the night. His tie was crooked, his jacket creased, but he looked like the only man in the room who could hold back a storm. "Is that it for now?" I asked, my voice lower than I intended, as if afraid to disturb the uneasy quiet of the office. The clerk, a young man who probably hadn't stamped many freeze requests in his short tenure, nodded. "That's it. Sales halted pending investigation. The documents you provided. They'll trigger a review." Outside, the morning sun cut through the clouds, bright but brittle. We left the building and stood on the steps for a moment, letting the crisp air wash over us. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I fished it out, thumbed to voicemail. Pastor Crane's voice, warm and steady, filled my ear. "We stand with you, Marshal. Let me know what we can do." The message ended with a soft click that felt more like a handshake than a goodbye. I glanced at Calvin. "Community center next," I said. He didn't argue. The community center hall was, as I remembered, modest, worn, but full of the kind of history that doesn't make it into books. The floorboards creaked in familiar protest under my boots. The chairs were arranged in a loose circle, as they always were for board meetings, their metal frames scuffed from years of use. The room smelled faintly of old wood and coffee. Someone had set up a pot at the side table, and its aroma mingled with the clean tang of lemon polish. Pastor Crane greeted me with a firm handshake, his other hand clasping mine. His eyes kind but keen. Searched my face for answers I wasn't sure how to give. "Glad you came," he said simply. I spoke more than I'd intended. I laid out the truth, the documents, the footage, the betrayal. The room fell into a heavy silence as I spoke, broken only by the occasional creak of a chair, as someone shifted uncomfortably. When I finished, the quiet lingered. Ewan's name, once spoken with pride in this room, now hung like a bitter echo. A few board members exchanged glances. Others stared at the floor. But slowly I saw heads nod, the beginnings of resolve settling into the room. "We'll help however we can," Pastor Crane said, voice steady. "You're not alone in this." That meant more than I could say. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Paperwork, phone calls, quiet moments where I caught myself staring at nothing, mind replaying every choice that had led to this. The freeze was filed. The battle lines drawn. Night fell fast, bringing with it a chill that crept through the cracks in my resolve. I was standing in the kitchen staring out at the dark yard when the knock came. I opened the door to find Ewan on the porch, pale, drenched to the skin. Sneakers soaked and squelching as he shifted his weight. His hair hung limp, rain dripping from the ends. His eyes met mine, hollow, desperate. "Dad," his voice cracked. "I need to explain." Ewan sat at the kitchen table, head in his hands. water dripping from his sleeves and forming small puddles on the worn wood. His breath came uneven, shoulders hunched, as if he could fold himself small enough to disappear. The storm outside had begun to ease the rain. Now a soft patter against the window, but the storm inside these walls still raged in the silence between us. I stood by the counter, watching him, unsure where to begin. The clock ticked on loud in the quiet room. My eyes drifted to the fridge, to the old photo of Dory, her kind gaze meeting mine from behind a magnet shaped like a horseshoe. That picture had been there so long, it felt like part of the house itself. Tonight it felt like she was watching, waiting to see what I'd do. Finally, Ewan spoke, voice rough. "I didn't mean for it to get this far, Dad." I stayed where I was, arms crossed, coffee mug cooling between my palms. "Go on." He exhaled shakily, fingers clenching the table's edge until his knuckles whitened. "It started with a loan, just to get ahead," I told myself. But then payments fell behind, interest piled up. "I thought I could fix it before you ever knew." His words spilled out the truth, raw and ugly. Credit cards maxed, missed rent on that apartment he never mentioned moving out of. A friend's bad investment scheme. A cascade of choices that led him here, to my kitchen, soaked through and broken. "I didn't want to disappoint you." His voice cracked and he shook his head like he could shake off the shame. But every step I took just made it worse. I listened. No shouting, no slammed fists on the table, just the deep ache of disappointment settling heavy in my chest. I thought of the boy I'd carried on my shoulders, who'd fallen asleep in the truck on long drives home from ball games. Where had that boy gone? When his words ran dry, I set the mug down and went to the door. The storm had left the night clean and cold, the air sharp in my lungs. I stepped onto the porch, found the tools I needed, and knelt at the door. My fingers worked the new lock, the metal cold and steady in my shaking hands. The click of the key fitting home was soft as a sigh, but in that sound was a weight, lifted a small piece, set right again. I turned back inside. Ewan hadn't moved, except his hands now covered his face. His shoulders shook, silent at first, then with quiet sobs that filled the space between the clocks ticking. I didn't want to lose everything, he whispered through the tears. I already lost myself. I stood there, the key warm now in my palm, and felt the choice before me as surely as I felt the ground under my boots. Before I could speak, the phone rang. The caller ID showed Pastor Crane's name. I answered, his voice steady as ever. "Marshall, the community's behind you. We want to help preserve the house, its legacy. Let's talk tomorrow." I looked at Ewan, broken at the table and out at the night beyond. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. I stood beneath the great stained glass window of the church hall, the morning sun slanting through the colored glass and casting the floor in a quilt of ruby, emerald, and gold. The oak tree at the center of the design, its trunk thick and roots deep, seemed to glow, the light setting its leaves ablaze. I stared at it for a long breath, drawing from its steady strength before turning my eyes down to the paperwork on the worn oak table in front of me. My pen hovered over the signature line, the tip trembling just enough to betray what my heart wouldn't say aloud. I felt the weight of the moment press into my shoulders. The document beneath my hand would create the Marshall Preservation Fund, tying my name and my home's legacy to this town for generations. My thumb brushed a small smudge of ink from the corner, almost as if I could erase the doubts that clung as stubbornly as that stain. Outside, the spring breeze stirred the flags in the town square, their bright colors rippling against the pale blue sky. The flagpoles creaked softly, a sound that mingled with the murmur of voices filtering in from townsfolk gathered on the steps. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass and rain-washed earth, the promise of a new season. I signed. The ink pooled for a beat at the tail of my last letter, forming a dark bead that soaked into the page, a small imperfection, but one that felt honest, like everything that had led me here. Pastor Crane watched me, hands clasped in front of him, his kind eyes steady. "You've done something good, Marshall," he said. Voice low but certain. "Hardship doesn't define a man, how he rises from it does." I let the words settle, nodding though my throat tightened around any reply. My gaze drifted across the room, past familiar faces. Neighbors, old classmates, men and women who'd watched Ewan grow up. They sat on folding chairs, worn at the edges, lined up in rows, that weren't quite straight. The air was warm with the scent of coffee and the faint polish of wood floors that had seen a century's worth of scuffed boots. And at the back, almost hidden by the shadow of the doorway, stood Ewan. His posture was small hands buried deep in his pockets, chin tucked. He kept his eyes on the floor as if the act of meeting anyone's gaze might shatter whatever fragile courage had brought him here. But he stayed. That meant something. The pastor invited me forward. I cleared my throat, heart pounding, and spoke of integrity, of legacy, of the duty we owe not just to ourselves, but to those who came before and those who'll come after. My words wove through the hall, sometimes faltering, sometimes steady, always from the place inside me that still believed in doing right, even when it hurt. When I mentioned community, hands folded, heads nodded, and a soft rustling filled the hall. The sound of folks shifting forward in their seats of resolve, taking root. When I glanced toward Ewan, he lifted his eyes just long enough for our gazes to meet. He gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, but I saw it. That nod cracked something open in me, a tiny fissure where grace might seep in. When the last paper was signed, the applause rose, not loud or raucous, but warm like the morning sun climbing over the hills. Pastor Crane clasped my shoulder. "You've turned a wrong into a right, Marshall, and you've reminded all of us why this place matters." Afterward, the folks didn't rush to leave. They lingered, offering quiet words, firm handshakes, and small promises I can help mend that fence. "Let me bring by some paint next week. We'll tidy the yard, get it ready for summer." Little things that together built something solid. Outside, the flags flapped sharp against the breeze, their shadows playing across the church steps. The town square felt different, not because it had changed, but because I had. Back home, I found a letter weighting the envelope thick, the handwriting familiar. Calvin's hand blocky, deliberate. I sat on the porch step, sun warm against my back, and opened it. "You did it the right way, friend. Proud of you. That house will stand long after both of us are gone. And so will your name." I folded the letter carefully, tucking it into the inside pocket of my jacket. The breeze carried the scent of lilacs from the bush Dory planted so many springs ago. Then came a knock at the door. Pastor Crane, again smiling, envelope in hand, the state seal clear on the flap. "They want you to speak at the Heritage Council next month," he said. "Your story, well, it's a good one. Folks ought to hear it." I laughed, a quiet, genuine laugh that felt new in my chest. "Guess I'd better find my Sunday suit." My father once told me I began my voice steady, but softer than I expected in the wide room, that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes courage is just doing what's right when no one's watching. The Heritage Hall was quiet, every polished brass fixture, catching the glow of afternoon sun filtering through high windows. Rows of faces, council members, local historians, a few curious onlookers, watched me from their seats, attentive, respectful. The wood-paneled walls seemed to lean in, as if the room itself was listening. I stood at the worn podium, my hand resting on its smooth edge, the grain of the oak warm under my palm. I took a slow breath, letting the weight of the moment settle. I told them the story. Not every gritty detail, not the rawest of the hurt, but enough. Enough to show how easily trust can be bent, how fragile the things we think are unshakable, and how with help, with faith, with community, we can set things right again. I spoke of the Preservation Fund not as my victory, but as a shared promise, a promise that the house and all it represented would stand for those who came next. The applause when it came wasn't loud or raucous. It was steady, warm, filling the space like light. One of the council members rose, a silver-haired woman with kind eyes. She smiled as she announced that the council would pledge a small grant to the Preservation Fund, enough to help restore the porch, maybe the fence too. I thanked them, meaning it, and stepped down from the podium, the soft creak of the wood beneath my boots grounding me as I returned to my seat. When the meeting ended, I shook hands, accepted congratulations with quiet grace, and made my way home as the day slipped toward evening. The house greeted me with familiar silence, the kind that wasn't empty, but peaceful. I stepped onto the porch, the boards firm beneath my weight, the lilac bush rustling softly in the breeze. The mailbox flag was down. I opened it and found a letter, no return address, but I knew the handwriting. Ewan's. I sat on the steps to read the envelope warm from the sun. His words were halting, the ink smudged in places, edges of the paper soft like it had been handled too much before he found the nerve to send it. Dad, I don't expect forgiveness overnight. I just want you to know I'm trying. I started seeing someone at the credit union. I'm working evenings at the hardware store. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I read it twice, then folded it carefully, sliding it into my shirt pocket close to my heart. The weight I'd carried so long seemed to ease, replaced by something quieter. Not joy, not yet, but hope. As dusk settled, I rose and walked to the door. The key in my hand was cool at first, then warmed by my grasp as I turned it in the lock. The soft click echoed in the quiet yard. I stood a moment longer, watching the moon lift above the trees, its pale light washing over the porch. Sometimes I thought closing the door behind me, the hardest chapters, leave us strongest where we broke. As I sat on the porch that night, the key now warm and familiar in my palm, felt like more than just metal. The breeze carried the soft scent of lilac, and the moonlight painted silver lines across the yard we'd worked so hard to protect. I realized that sometimes the hardest trials aren't meant to break us, but to show us what's truly worth holding on to. Bridges may collapse, but it's in the rebuilding we learn their value. If you've ever faced a moment that forced you to choose between bitterness and hope, I'd love to hear how you found your way. Share your story below. Your courage might light someone else's path.